Hey everybody, welcome back to another Simulacra Developer Diary. My name is CJ. So this is going to be a little bit more of a tutorial video this week, kind of doing an overview of some of the Foliage workflow improvements that I've been working on and kind of showcase them in kind of a loose kind of overview. And I figure if any of you have any questions or comments, you can just ask them down below so that we can kind of move through at a nice clip. So this was inspired by a tutorial I saw a while back by the talented folks over at Eat3D, and I'll link that in the description below. But essentially what it was covering was the idea of generating flexible kind of leaf shapes in Substance Designer and being able to use those to uh, either generate variations that you would then turn into 3D and then render out, or kind of what have you. So I took that idea and kind of extended it out into different kind of scatter utilities and other things so that I can create really nice flexible tiling textures or sections of textures for use on the actual models. So the leaf maker, as I'm calling it, is this kind of ugly spider web. This is the one that I'm not really going to go over in much detail because it's essentially what he was covering in his video, just to a slightly different effect. The one kind of departure that or not departure, improvement I should say, was that his kind of alpha shapes, as they are by kind of generated by the raw shapes, have a very, very harsh edge to them, and also can get these kind of more jagged bite marks because we're using waveforms to kind of take little kind of chomped edges out of that. And that can be excellent in what you want, but I'm going for a little bit more of a stylized thing, so that was just a little bit too harsh and I wanted control over that edge. So what I did was essentially piped this fairly ready alpha into a blur node, just high quality grayscale. Um, and in doing so, I can control the intensity as you would expect of how wide that feather is going to be. So put it back to my default of 2, and then pipe the result into this histogram scan node. And effectively what that does is gives you control over that kind of border area. So wherever it is transitioning from solid white to solid black, that border zone is kind of what the histogram scan is acting on. So by using the position, I can actually affect where that kind of middle point lands. So you see that as I'm pushing the position in and out, it's pulling that border in and out. So that's super duper useful. I also have exposed the contrast. Some of these it's very much in process, so I'll probably actually expose this position so that I can affect it on the kind of filter level or the graph level. But then by using the contrast, I can affect how tight that border is. And the result is, instead of, that's not exactly a great preview of it, but because it's blurring the result and then tightening it, I effectively get the same silhouette, but it's smoothing a lot of those border areas and giving me a lot more kind of an organic shape, which is definitely more of what I'm after. So with that kind of dispensation out of the way, I'll go over just very briefly what I'm doing here and then go into the individual nodes themselves. So to put together this kind of leaf mass kind of hedge thing, what I'm doing is I'm using my leaf maker to create one for the larger scattered leaves. So you see these have a little bit more detail, they're a little larger. And then another variation, not really much huge difference right now, but I have the flexibility of changing that. And then using that to create the kind of lower level of leaves. So then I'm running both of them through this leaf scatter graph. So this is another graph that I'll be going into. And essentially what this does is it's really just ganging a whole bunch of these splatter or splatter circle or both of them together, and running all of them through using the same settings. So uh, because I'm generating a height map, I'm generating a color alpha because I'm doing gradient mapping on these to colorize them, and then I've also got the alpha. If I'm scattering those using just the spatter, it would mean that if I changed one of the settings here, I would have to change it for all three duplicates, and that can be really time intensive. It's really prone to error. So really what the scatter graph is just making all of those duplicates obey the same settings so that I can set it just on this one location, and then also combining together using the circular splatter so that I can make these kind of radial arrangements of leaves and then scatter those around so you get that nice kind of open flower shape. This is probably good. So you can see that they all of these clusters have this nice radial arrangement, but then they're scattered around to create this kind of dense foliage. Over here, I'm basically just blending the two materials together using a material blend, and that's just kind of to easily combine those two together using the alpha of so this top one just allows all of the content built in here to be added on top of the other one without clipping things out. So nothing crazy going on there. I've got another custom node here, which is the leaf normal var. That's short for variation, and that's essentially giving me the ability to, in the normal map, randomly pitch any of these leaves in a different direction. So I'll up the variation color. So you see that all of these have a random tone to them, and the more I pitch that up, it's a little hard to see in the preview, but especially the shinier the leaves are, you'll see it looks like they're kind of rotated in a slightly different directions, and helps to ease that kind of flat feeling and make them feel a little bit more organic. And then the last one is this colorize node, and that is basically just doing fairly standard gradient mapping as you would if you were just adding in a gradient map and using the gradient editor to kind of change the color to whatever you want. It's a little bit more specialized, and it's basically supposed to be kind of a preview of what I'm going to be doing in game. So the base color that's being shown here is actually not going to be used in engine. It's mainly meant as a preview, whereas this gradient texture is actually what will be used in editor. And then using the position, I can actually shift and get kind of drastically different color results on these leaves. And that gives me a really, really kind of high level tool to kind of make sure that the color of all of the foliage is really nice and tight and tied together, but also varied between the areas and so on and so forth. So I'll dive into here real quick. Hopefully make things pretty fast and easy. Um, like I said, most of these are pretty simple, and I'm breaking it apart this way um, because I really want to be able to use these graphs in other locations and, kind of find a lot of happy accidents that way. It's actually something that they were talking about with the development of Uncharted 4 and the substance designer use in that the development of that game. So again, pretty straightforward. This is essentially taking the input, so I'm using a height to create the normal map detail. I've got a color alpha, that's what I'm using to use with the gradient mapping, and then the alpha, which is just the mask of the individual leaves. So all of these get piped into individual circular scatter nodes. I still need to uh, clean up the naming conventions and make sure that those are nice and clear. But if you haven't done anything like this before, you can just place one of these. You can then choose expose parameters and then choose all of the parameters that you want. And then I essentially just copied and pasted each of those. So the only variation here, and the reason why there's two of these down here, is one of them is being used for just the straight alpha, and then the other one, the bottom luminance random, is all the way full, and that essentially just randomly assigns a grayscale value to the individual duplicates, and that's what is giving me that normal variation texture. And then these in-betweens are basically just grayscale switches. So on the graph level, I can say I want to use the circular scatter, or I want to use the splatter, or I want to use both of them. And that just gives me the ability to kind of switch those on and off. And then the only thing done back here is actually turning the height map into a normal map using the normal node, and then just doing an RGBA split because I like not having the alpha associated with it. So that just gives me the clean normal map as the result. And the color alpha is just taking it's basically just cleaning out the backdrop so that actually no, sorry, the this is actually using an auto levels to maximize the range of the variations and then applying a subtle amount of that to the color alpha so that each of the leaves is just a little bit different in their color range for when they're getting gradient mapped. And kind of jumping over to the normal variation, because that would be the next step in the process, I essentially used this kind of idea of, if you've got a sphere that you create a normal map of, you get, as it's kind of shifting in each of these individual directions, you get these solid colors at each of the cardinal directions. So what I did was I took just a smooth gradient, and then I made a gradient map of that, and I essentially sampled each of those cardinal direction colors at each of these points so that they would be evenly distributed. Obviously, the two ends are the same so that it wraps around smoothly. And then I use that in a gradient dynamic node so that when the variation texture comes in here, it's then colorized with these random colors along this spectrum, and that essentially just chooses each of the individual leaves will land somewhere randomly along this edge and will look like they are pitched in that direction. And then later on, with the exposed normal blend, where these are actually being combined together, I'm just using the opacity uh, to basically control the strength of that effect. And the only other thing back here is just adding on a slight high quality blur, because it's unfortunately I can't really show it here, but the downside of using this kind of gradient mapping technique is that along the edges where the white or whatever color is then falling off to the other colors, you'll get these kind of fine bands of another color around them, and that just introduces a little bit of noise. So because this is kind of a subtle technique, you can just kind of blur that out, and then when you combine them on top of it, you don't really tell that one leaf is bleeding into another leaf just ever so slightly. So and yeah, to make this work, you just need the normal map. You need the variation texture, which has the random grayscale value for each of the leaves or whatever you're using, and then the actual alpha mask, so that you can, when you're combining them together, you can clip those shapes out. And then the last one is the colorize, and again, this is a little specialized. This is particular to my game because I want to do runtime gradient mapping, and you can effectively ignore all of this in terms of the technique. I'm essentially just bringing in the color alpha mask and then doing a gradient map on it and then outputting that as the base color. So that effectively is creating my base color for the preview. All of this other stuff is essentially creating the gradient colors that I want to use in the game. So I start by using a gradient linear to just create, a white to black. Then use a gradient map to actually colorize the leaves to whatever I want them to be. And so I'm creating different, color options, and those have really nice, this is kind of where the shadows would be. So it's got kind of a warmer color out to the, the more highlighted areas, so on and so forth. And something that you can do both in Engine and also in the preview is this gradient input position essentially governs where vertically on this gradient is it sampling across. So most of the times you're going to see just a solid gradient like this, but if you combine them together into something like this that has different zones, you can effectively use that number to smoothly shift that kind of horizontal sample area to anywhere on this, on this gradient. So again, I'm trying to be as flexible as possible and make it, really easy on myself to maintain. So what I did here was I took a vertical gradient. I added a contrast luminosity. That's mainly just so I have a little bit of control on the pinch, and that'll be more clear here. So this quantize is basically posterizing all of these zones into however many steps you want it to have. So that's essentially creating my target zones of how many kind of selections that do I want to create here, so that I can easily update that. I can make a greater number. And the reason why I added this contrast luminosity is because it's not strictly 100% evenly spaced. So just by having a little bit of contrast control, I can shift that so that depending on what I've chosen, I can make those a little bit more even so that they're nice and distributed. So that's why that's there. Then this is kind of the area where I hope to improve, because it's not much, but it is a little bit more labor intensive than it should be. So I'm essentially doing a gradient map to turn the grayscale in black and white into a color black and white, and then using color to mask to sample those individual areas and get those actual zones as totally black and white areas. So I'm essentially using this green one as my base, grabbing the gray area to create this mask, and then stamping this more kind of rosy color over it, and then same thing, stamping the blue over the top using this color mask. And then the final step, just to kind of erase any really sharp borders, is to use a directional blur. And the reason I'm doing this instead of another one is because if you look at the tiling version of the texture, I don't want the darker areas to bleed over. Actually, in Unreal, to make it work the way that you want it to, you actually intentionally want to clamp the x-axis. And so by using a directional blur, I can effectively channel all of the blurring to be up and down, so that it's not affecting and making that bleed do what I don't want it to do. And then so I would get this gradient texture. I could then import it into Unreal, and then any of the previews that I'm getting in my tester version, I can then easily recreate by effectively just matching the position in the material. So I'm pretty excited about that. This is something that I may vary it slightly on a per instance basis. So some, in a cluster, some of the plants are a little bit more weathered or a little bit more saturated or whatever, or I may just vary it on a per environment basis if I'm trying to reuse some of the foliage, and just make it a little bit more interesting and match the the color of the area. So this is just a example of a kind of a quick version. I used just the leaf maker and a single scatter, just using the circular splat to create this kind of frond that I'm going to put on just a straight quad, and kind of have floating above the foliage to create a little bit more of a sense of depth, or at least that's what I'm trying out. But so it's kind of an example of the fact that I can use these same exact nodes to get something that is wildly different from the other result. And the cool thing about this, as with all of the Substance Designer stuff, is that I can change pretty much whatever I want, and it will churn through and update everything. Oh, I'm actually doing the circle. That's why it's not updating. But yeah, change the rotation, and it will run through and update everything and create these really nice tiling textures for my game. So as always, I know that was a lot and it was pretty fast. I hope it made sense and was interesting to some people. And as I've done a couple of kind of more art related stuff, I'll try to dive back into the game next week. But as I mentioned, I'm in the process of moving and a whole bunch of other things, so things will be a little thinner for a little while. So I will do my best to keep everyone up to date, but please be patient as I'm transitioning. And as always, leave your thoughts and comments down below. I really appreciate any feedback that you have for me. And yeah, that's pretty much it. thanks very much for tuning in. I hope to see you again here soon, and have a fantastic rest of your week. Bye.